I'm very excited because we have Tamara Perkins. Am I pronouncing that right? Or is it Tamara?
Tamara
Yeah. Perkins, there we go. Who's been working on this documentary called Life After Life.
Life After Life is something that came out of, oh my gosh, many years of working in grief and trauma and trying to really stay grounded in healing. So basically, Life After Life follows 3 men who are incarcerated as teenagers, who spent 10, 20, and 30 years in prison. But the film itself is really about unaddressed childhood trauma. It's about the impact of absence on families. It's about the precarious journey home for men and women coming home from incarceration. And that just, the journey to build a life for the first time and to reconnect with family, especially after 10, 20, and 30 years, but also just being the first time that you're able to come home and build a life as an adult, as a free adult. Yeah. So one of the things that's coming up right now is we have 2 big screenings in Florida. They're going to be in Miami and Bradenton, Sarasota. Miami on Saturday, January 26th, and in Bradenton, Sarasota on Tuesday, January 29th. And this is all part of a big effort to mobilize the largest criminal justice reform day ever. It's going to be taking place in Tallahassee on March 13th. And so we're going to be putting out the word to folks, and the ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center and Campaign for Criminal Justice Reform are our partners in this, and they will actually they will help people get to Tallahassee for that day if they're interested. So that's a big thing that's happening this month. We have, we continue to have actions happening around the country, but people can find out more at lifeafterlifemovie.com. On our website, you can connect with our Facebook and Twitter, but lifeafterlifemovie.com is the website. As far as how people can get involved, I mean, I think it's everything from have these conversations, that are really challenging, with each other, and then look for the organizations that are being run by formerly incarcerated folks, because those are the organizations that I've seen are most connected, to the work, and are having the most impact. I mean, and then I think, ways on the ground. I mean, there are sort of traditional things like going to schools and reading with students, getting involved in programs that support, youth.
Like Big Brother, Big Sister kind of stuff.
Big Brother, exactly. I was thinking of Big Brother, Big Sister. There are other programs, but that's everyone knows that one, right? And I mean, those are ways in which we can get back involved in our community. And of course, everybody has to vote. You need to be aware of what's happening, in our country. I think that a great website, by the way, to find out statistics and really just understand a little bit more of the landscape within mass incarceration in our country is the Sentencing Project. So that's Mark Maurer's group, and they're really amazing. They talk about it when things are going better. They also talk about the things that are not going so great, and understanding things like incarceration is increasing in rural areas now. Yeah, they're starting to do a little better in metropolitan areas, but now it's getting worse in rural areas. That's
interesting.
Having an understanding of really what's happening, which maybe can also help you to decide what area moves you the most, right? Yeah. But yeah, those are a few things. I think that if you are a lawyer You can, there are ways that you can volunteer time to provide legal support for folks. And, you know, it's, depending on your skills, there are ways to get involved.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I don't have a better list.
No, that's great. I'm going to put a list below as well, as far as like ideas and things that kind of people can go to. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
I know a lot of local organizations. I could send you some, but
that's perfect, because you know people because people from all over the world see this kind of thing. You know, I have people in Florida, so people will see this. So local organizations is perfect, which I think that a lot of people would argue that's where there's more strength. Is in local organizations. Maybe the reason that you are seeing more incarceration in rural areas than in the inner city, quote unquote, right now, or that seeing that change, is because a lot of nonprofits focus their interests on quote unquote the inner city. So, you know, is it the question of where the private sector is focusing, where our hearts and minds are focusing? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But
we would love for your viewers to support us and, you know, come to Life After Life movie, check it out. We also will have information about when the video or when the film is going to be available for a wide release as well. So,
yay!
But if you're in Florida, come see us.
What are some of the challenges that they kind of go through after they've come out of prison?
Well, you know, it's funny. Noel, who's the older gentleman in the film, talks about the fact that when he went to prison, there were 8 tracks, which I don't know if everybody knows what an 8-track is, but it's a really old, like, cassette
music device.
It's about this big. It's huge. And so for him to come home and, you know, there are computers and cell phones and, you know, life is just very different and very fast. And, you know, he's got this huge family that, you know, just continues to grow. He's a grandfather with 3, let's see, 1, 2, 3, now 4 grandchildren. And then, and his parents, like, he came home and 42 days after he came home, his mother died.
Yeah.
And it was kind of, you know, it was bittersweet, right? Because his whole determination about coming home was to get home to his mother.
Yes.
His mother, who had always been there for him, who had always stood by his side, and now who was, you know, who had shriveled to, you know, this woman in a wheelchair who was, you know, still full of joy, but just holding on so that she could see her son. So, I mean, these are just some of the things that come up for folks, you know, coming home, because I think Harrison said once, like, it's like being sent into outer space, and you have to, like, learn how to breathe out there, right? I mean, I don't think that any of us could really understand it. I mean, 10 years is a long time. 30 years is a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Especially for somebody our age. So I imagine that you get kind of the big question that comes up for a lot of viewers listening to this is always, oh, well, what did they do? Because there's always this question of, you know, whether or not people deserve to have a certain period of their life taken away or not.
Right.
So when those kind of questions come up, what are kind of the big things that you are looking to address? For example, we have in Puerto Rico, I was doing a little bit of work with a few ex-cons who would go away for a drug thing or for an altercation with somebody, and then when they come back, they can't find any work at all because they have a record, so they can't get any employment. So because they can't get any employment, they, after trying a couple years, they become real discouraged. They can't afford anything. They're homeless, and they get back into the only thing that they know how to do. And so you end up having repeat offenders, you know, in the area because I can't make any money, right? Ends up being the issue. And so people kind of ask, well, because people say, well, why are you worried about, you know, those people when what about the victim of so-and-so? What kind of inequalities or issues are you seeing with the kind of things that people are being put away for? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. So, this is a complex question because I think what I've seen, most of my colleagues in the film world have done films or made films about folks who are in for a nonviolent crime because it's just, easier to swallow, right?
Yeah.
But, my life has been, steeped in grief and trauma and healing work, right? So I felt, well, first of all, the people that I met while I was teaching yoga in San Quentin were all serving a life sentence. And so that meant that the majority of the men and some of the women in the other prisons I worked with were in for murder. And so first degree, second degree murder, and yet most of them had been incarcerated while when they were teenagers. Wow. So, they were children when they went to prison and, committed this, heinous act that, no one can argue that, and their lives will always be shadowed by the life that's gone. Yeah. Right. The life that's taken, even though I think for most of them, they didn't completely understand, the impact, of the act. I think maybe except for Noel. Noel, I think almost he immediately sort of gave himself over to God. He just, that was the thing that he decided, because when it happened and, the weight of it hit him, so obviously he didn't wake up that day and decide this is what I'm going to do. It was something that happened in a robbery that he should never, in a situation he should never have been in. And it's not something that he can ever forget, and he'll never forget the person whose life he took. And that's something that, he talks about all the time. And I think that it's important for us, to understand that someone's worst act does not have to be their entire life, and so when I started the film, I asked questions. We talked through, whether people would be, really ready to talk about what happened. Yeah. Because that's part of it. You have to be able to take responsibility and accountability, and it's a painful thing to recount. It's a painful thing to have to talk about. Yeah. Right. Because all of the men that are involved in the film, they've continued to be involved in the outreach and the engagement. A lot of what we do is outreach to young people, to try to reach them before they get to a point where their life is changed, in ways
you gotta
that
ask what brought the teenager to the robbery. Who was there, who provided that opportunity? Why did that come up?
And it's complex, right? Like, it's not an easy thing. I think, often there's a lot of homelessness. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of being, getting involved with gangs and drugs. There's definitely a lot of abuse and neglect. On top of that, you've got, deeply and systemically racist systems that are ready to, bring you into the system as soon as they can. And once you hit a system once, your likelihood of being incarcerated is increased by something like 75 to 90%. So even getting CPS called, which is in some cases is really necessary to save a child or help out a household, that it exponentially increases your the likelihood that you'll go to prison. So as far as it's a hard one to talk about, but we talk about this in almost every screening, right? Because who benefits, who heals when someone is thrown away? How does anyone heal? But if Noel and Harrison and Chris can come home and they can make sure that they're there for their families, they can come out and do, work to support other young people and the community. If they can just be, a productive member of society, like, that's actually better for all of us. And, that's something that I think is something we all have to kind of come to on our own, right? And I'm a crime survivor, so I understand. I've had a gun to my head 4 times in my life, and I feel like I was very close to, unfortunately, losing my life once, and I am very grateful to be here. But that young man was 17, and I don't know where his family was or his parents were, but he was obviously, he had obviously lost his way.
Yeah.
And not in a good space. And I think that instead of demonizing children for getting on a path that's often laid out for them, there should be more of a focus on healing.
Do you, because what you're saying really ends up bringing up a very difficult point where you have people or families of victims who are very angry or very upset, or, they want to see justice served. And as a victim of crime yourself, I'm sure you can kind of understand essentially this pull, right, from both sides for what is justice, making sure that justice is served. Because you have people who are, horribly raped, right? And then how is that, and we already have an issue with sexual assault not receiving justice in this country, right? You might get 9 months. There are some states where you can get 9 months for rape, but 10 years for marijuana possession, right? Which is astounding, right? So the family of that rape and murder victim or that rape victim, how, essentially, how do you approach healing for somebody like that? With those kind of obviously heinous crimes that kind of raise those emotional buttons, right? This is a topic that everybody's hairs go up because everybody's
I have a daughter, so
yeah, exactly.
I have a 4-year-old. I'm definitely it definitely pushes all the buttons for me, and I have definitely met folks who were coming home after sentences of related to some sort of sexual assault, right? And that was not the case with any of the men in our film, but I do think it's a really important thing to think about. It's funny, I interviewed a lot of people for Life After Life, and I didn't end up using the footage because it was just so much more poignant to just have the men themselves tell their story. Yeah. But one of the people that I interviewed is Angela Davis, and she's an internationally known activist. And I thought I was going to talk to her, that she was going to talk to me about abolition. And instead, she talked to me almost immediately, went into talking about sexual assault and the need to really start thinking about it in a deeper way and not being afraid to talk about it. And she mentioned there's a group in San Francisco called Generation 5. Yeah. And their whole mission is to end child abuse and sexual assault within 5 generations.
Yeah. That's a very, that's a very, very high goal. I think you have a challenge when you come up with something like that, like showing the victim her life is important, right? Mm-hmm. That we're not slapping on the wrist and, oh, it's okay. On the other hand, there are things that drive somebody to this situation, even something like sexual assault, right? So would you say, where would you say kind of the solutions are to that balance? Because that's a very tough, yes, you're valuable. Yes, it's not right what happened to you. Yes, we're going to find you justice versus, yes, it's not fair how you were brought up. Yes, it's not fair how this situation came up. Yes, you're still a human being with value, even though you did this thing, right? Finding a way to value the victim and the perpetrator, I think, is incredibly difficult. Are there, and it's okay if you don't have a real quick answer to this, but what kind of solutions are there that we're kind of looking for those kind of?
Yeah, I think it all comes back. I think it all comes back to healing, right? Okay. So, and when I say that healing, I'm not just talking obviously about the perpetrator. I'm very specifically talking about the person who was harmed, right? So, this kind of, I don't want to say barbaric sort of view of justice where someone, an eye for an eye or whatever that is we think is the right way to do it. I do think that there's a balance between accountability and and to focus more on healing. So as a victim, I am much more interested in the person that harmed me never harming anyone else.
Yeah.
And there being support for me to heal.
Yeah.
Both. Like, I want support to heal, and I want to make sure that that person never harms someone else.
Yeah.
So our current system is more about warehousing and punishing.
Mm-hmm.
And while there's definitely a need for a timeout, which I know, like, Noel and Harrison talked about that, like, we needed a timeout because, you know, otherwise we were going to die.
Yeah.
Or someone else might, you know, either way, like, that was something bad was going to happen at that point, and
that's interesting. So something had to happen. There had to be some kind of, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, like, nothing would have changed for them if they had not found the strength within themselves. And in many cases, for example, Noel and Harrison found each other in San Quentin, and for 10 years were like brothers.
Yeah.
You know, supporting one another, even when, like, it's a segregated, you know, yard. Like, they weren't even really supposed to be hanging out because Harrison's Samoan and Noel is Mexican American, right? So, you know, they actually talked about the first time they met, and it was supposed to be an altercation, and instead they ended up becoming friends. And you know, those kind of things, like, they really make the change, they make the difference. So I just want to make sure and clear that I think there has to be a focus on healing for everyone, right? And so the idea of punishment being the rule of the day means that nothing is done for the victim.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that punishing someone else does not help heal the victim.
Yeah.
You know, and that's something that anyone who has dealt with that and has had to deal with the pain of losing someone and only having festering hate.
Yeah.
You know, fill that hole. That does not heal you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the answer has to always come back to that. Like, do we want to have healthy communities? You know, do we want to have productive societies? Do we want, you know, do we want to move in a direction that's positive? Because right now we just warehouse and create more harm.
Yeah. And I think that's something that almost everybody on, I think, all sides of the political aisle can kind of agree on, that something's not working. And so then where do the solutions go? It's interesting you had brought up before we were talking about looking to other countries kind of, or other models for kind of solutions. Mm-hmm. And something you said kind of brought to mind a very, very old model that I remember reading, where if you steal something, you have to, and this is a model created just after Hammurabi, but if you steal something, you don't go to jail for it, you have to repay the person 4 times what you stole. Right, because the goal is on returning to the victim what they are owed, not, you know, the goal is not on just punishment, which is, I think, a very different system than something that we have now. Like, what if all petty, you know, thieves and things like that had to pay it back instead of going to prison? Like, you had a parole system that followed them, making sure that they were, you know, that things were being paid back. That would be a very different system than here we lock you up and the victim doesn't get anything back and nothing else. So it's a very simple example. Now obviously it's more challenging for something like theft, or for something that theft is very different than like something like harm, right? But it's that kind of focus, I think, is a very different focus.
But we do have retribution. Like, there are retribution payments that people have to pay. But the thing is that people, when you're incarcerated, you get
can't.
paid.
Yeah, you can't. Like, how are you going to make any money when you're in prison?
Like, I mean, $1 an hour. Now, what if we actually paid people a comparable wage for the work that they were doing?
Yeah.
And then they could send money home to their families. They could pay retribution in a much higher amount, right?
Or we didn't put them away. They just can work. And pay
they could work, right?
Yeah.
Well, there are cases like where maybe you need some sort of timeout, right? But I definitely that gets into some deeper stuff, right? Because I think when you talk about abolitionism, it we need more things in place. Like we definitely would need more things that are available for healing, from the mental health perspective, from addiction perspective, all of that. But in that case, then yes. Yeah, I think that there would definitely be a way to not have people necessarily, go away, at least not for the decades that they're going away for now. We have people that are serving 400 years. Like obviously they're not going to live that long, but I mean, they're not coming home. Right. Yeah. And is that really helpful for us, especially when it costs in California $76,000 a year to house that person? If it's a child, if it youth, it can cost up to $250,000 a year to house the person. And
who is that benefiting? You kind of bring it all back to, I mean, who's that benefiting? When you think about the victim thinking about somebody being in prison year after year, getting angrier and angrier and angrier and angrier, it's actually a scary thing. Not really a positive thing, because you think about, okay, well, that person really hates me and is angry at me. What happens if they get out, right? Rather, you keep kind of this cycle of hate thought instead of this. It's
usually not that though. Usually people get bored and they're like reading Shakespeare. I mean, honestly, like it's very different than we think of.
Absolutely, because we're not there.
It's boring. It's quiet. It's lonely. It's dirty. It's dangerous. I mean, lots of things, but mostly it's boring. And having spent many long days in San Quentin, mostly because I would come to teach a class and then you couldn't actually get out for a few hours or something. So and to realize like I maybe didn't have access to a bathroom for 8 hours, but how much longer was it for the people I was leaving behind, right? Yeah. Just not having access to water or food or bathroom, like you're just so isolated. Yes. And all of your movements controlled and that. And so that kind of speaks to another thing, like how does that prepare you to come back and deal with a world that is moving so fast and that you have to be ready to, to move and deal with things on, at lightning speed. And really, you need all of the knowledge of the years that you lost, right? Yeah. Because let's say if you're incarcerated starting at 13, 14 years old, and you come home at 40, you've lost all the time which you would have been learning to build responsibility, to have your first bank account, to have a job, to have a car, to understand, navigating relationships. And I mean, there's a lot that's missed, right? Yeah. So, I think another thing we forget is that until about 30 years ago, we're getting closer to 40 years ago, sentences for murder, for example, were closer to 10 years, maybe 10, 12 years, right? And then there were Pell Grants. You could go to school while you were incarcerated. You may be able to come home and actually work. And not have to go back to an old life. Maybe you had AA, whatever, something that was helping you. One of the most incredible men I've ever met, he unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he was Professor John Irwin. He started this program called Project Rebound that provides wraparound support and basically mostly free college for formerly incarcerated folks. And he went to prison in the 50s. Yeah. And he served 5 years. And he found education. And he went all the way. And he became a professor. And he wrote like 8 or 9 books on around incarceration and also like the lifers and things like that, and started this program. And so he was such an example of what could happen for folks if they were just introduced to another way. Yeah. Right? As education is not just about jobs, it's also about breaking the box that you were born in, right? Yes.
Making different opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah, and seeing yourself differently. So there's I think education's always, solution. You want some of the solutions. All right. There should definitely be a focus on education. There should be a focus on mental health and addiction, really, understanding and providing services for that. You're a doctor, you understand a bit more about that, right? And then, also make sure that people get paid a living wage and maybe a comparable wage for the work that they're doing, and that money then goes back to take care of families that are left behind, children that are left behind.
Yeah.
And so let's say Noel actually learned a skill. He became a welder, and now he's working in that field in a union, and was able to buy a house.
Wow.
But if he had been being paid that entire time the comparable wage, even if it wasn't a union wage, but like a normal whatever wage, that would have been money that went and to retribution to the victim's family. That would have been money that went home to his children, to his grandchildren, to his parents.
Yeah.
And that's something that actually supports that supports us in the community. Yeah. And maybe that means another child isn't going to get in trouble, or
because his child then is well taken care of.
Yeah, right. That whole generational thing, right? And also seeing him in school, like, oh, instead of going this path, actually, let's go to school.
Yeah.
Harrison, for my film, he got his degree. He's not the first now, or he's not the last in his family now. He was one of the first in his family to get a degree, and now his nieces are going to college. His sister actually went back to school.
Yes.
So seeing people of his generation and the next following suit, because now education becomes a tradition in the family.
Yeah.
So again, I know this is hard to jump from punishment to this. What I think I remember years ago hearing more about, how could we give these benefits to folks who are incarcerated? Why do we give them school? Why do we give them? Well, I mean, that kind of ties back into two things. One is, what kind of community do we want to have?
Yeah.
What kind of neighborhoods do we want to have? What kind of what kind of society do we want to have and create? And then also kind of really understanding that these are things that were not afforded to them.
Yeah, that they didn't have. Yeah.
They didn't have, right? So, and that, again, has to kind of, we have to reckon with our, with the systemic racism and bias that is driving our country. And I think it's hard for folks to talk about it because they don't want to feel like they are harming anyone.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the better way to think about it is, what are ways that I can be aware of my bias and make changes? What are ways in which I can notice bias in our laws and speak out against it? What are ways in which, I can take that to the ballot to voting, right? And I think that's a better way than just, falling into a blame, blame.
So you get into really big, like, systemic, kind of far-reaching things when you answer that. I think some people maybe hearing might say, oh, but you just said, Noel and Harrison, sounds like they both had happy endings, so the system is working. Some people might think. How would you answer that and kind of explain to people that, okay, this is not because of the system, this is because they found XYZ or XYZ group provided this to them? We were talking beforehand about kind of nonprofit groups and different agencies that are kind of making these opportunities. You've named a few. What was it that gave those opportunities to them? Was it the system, or was it something else that kind of helped these gentlemen to be able to kind of move forward?
Right. Well, I mean, first, Noel would say that, like, that he still is haunted by both his own crime, but also just those years of absence, by feeling out of place, like he doesn't belong. Because he spent the majority of his life in a cage, right? And you see a glimpse of it, but it's it's too small. We don't allow one dog to live in a cage this size, and yet there were two men sleeping.
Yeah.
in the cell, and that's, commonplace, right? Um, and there are just ways in which there are scars that never leave you, right? So, um, I wouldn't say that ending is incredibly happy, but
Yeah.
he's doing really well, and he is, he has a wonderful life. He's very happy, in many ways, but scarred
Yeah.
also, right? So first, let's say that, but as far as what was most helpful for them, I mean, I would say each other. Noel and Harrison came home at the same time, and so they were constantly on the phone with one another. They were able to check in and like just break down and cry, and even like compare notes, like, so how do you get on, what's the thing with the bus, what's the thing with the BART, how do all of those things that seem really simple to us, but
it's like moving to a new country and having somebody it's
moving to a country and feeling a spotlight on you constantly. So not only did you not know how to do it, but you were terrified that someone was going to see you do it wrong and you were going to get in trouble.
Yeah. I think I'd also want to emphasize to people that this is really the minority story. That it's to me, well, not just to me, but statistically, you don't usually have even that kind of ending where you come out and you get a job or then you're working. Usually, like you mentioned, the 75% basically repeat rate. Or like once you get touched by a system, you're 75% likely to get touched again.
Right.
Especially once you get up to the kind of, you've been incarcerated level, the chance is absolutely astronomical, your chances of going back, right? Because you don't usually, and going back with a more violent crime or a higher offense. So clearly the system is not working towards making people happy, productive citizens. In fact, it's more likely to make you more angry or more this or more that, just because you don't come out.
I don't know about the anger thing. I mean, the thing is that like what happened. And first, I do want to just talk about the differences in recidivism, right? Because short-term incarcerated sentencing, like usually there's more recidivism when someone's going in for 1, 3, 5, really short-term sentences, drug offenses, things like that, because let's say you have addiction, mental health, and and you haven't got any other skill than selling drugs, and and you're not getting any, you're not compelled to do any kind of training, you're not learning anything while you're there, you're just sort of sitting it out, and then
and you meet more violent people. You meet people who are more dangerous than you. So even if you're not angry, there's other situations that you're being exposed to that are going to kind of further that trauma.
And you're being used and often abused by those. I mean, that's unfortunately something I've had to hear more and more about. Like, you go in and you think you're really hard on the streets, and then suddenly you're being made to do things like, carry weapons into the yard, and you just imagine why you have to carry those, right? And like the things that happen to you while you're incarcerated, and so I mean, there's definitely more scars that can happen in that. So the recidivism rate's much higher there. Even then, if you add education to the mix, so someone with a 4-year degree, like you go in, you get a 4-year degree, let's say, or start it and come home and finish it, then recidivism rates can go from 70 to 90% down to something like 4%, right? Wow. So that's one situation with education, right? Now with folks who have been incarcerated and are serving a life sentence, so something, like are in for murder or something like that, the recidivism rates for folks coming home are closer to something like 1%.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So something like that, you're usually serving at least 10 years, right? And that was at the minimum. And now, of course, it's more like 20 or 30 or 40 or something like that.
Yeah.
But and I want to take the time out of it, but there's something, I I think that that you're compelled to do programming, which is a big deal. If you're serving a life sentence, so you can't get out unless you, are released by a parole board found suitable, by a parole board, and you often have access to education. You have access to mental health and kind of self-help development groups and programs. And most of these are led by incarcerated men or women, depending on the facility. And those are the most impactful. So you think you maybe are getting in just because you have to do the work, right? And then you meet folks who have similar situations, or and then the healing and the work begins. So that's one thing you also see, is that the most impactful work is done by folks who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, right? Which is another reason why I wanted to bring attention to the men in the film, because when I met them, they were incarcerated and thought maybe they would never come home.
Yes.
And yet they still did all of this work with young people that were brought in for, it's not the Scared Straight, but there's a couple programs in San Quentin that are really about getting kids to open up, communicate about what's going on with them, try to reconnect and that. And so they were doing this kind of work with youth, as well as leading health fairs inside the prison, doing a lot of work that they knew would go back to the families. Like, even if people were incarcerated, short or long term, like, they're always in communication with their families. And so that knowledge, that, those new skills would go home, with their families. So that, I think that's another thing to kind of keep in mind. I think I'm lost now.
No, you're fine. So
got this right.
kind of, no, that's great. So I think one issue, because you have a lot of, like I mentioned before, a lot of really strong feelings about this. And I think kind of listening to what you've said, some people might be like, well, but okay, so the longer sentences have a lower recidivism rate, so they're working better. But kind of listening to what you're saying, it really seems like you really feel it's more because we have more intense programming and more careful, kind of more careful observation and tracking of what's going on with that person mentally, and
access to programs. That's a big thing. Like, you might be in, people who are in for a shorter time, you may not have access to education programs or any of the other programs, so it's a hard thing, right? Like, so compelling someone to do something like that before they go home, it gets into just sort of, there should be access to those things as you're coming home too, right? Like, there should be, as soon as you are incarcerated, there should be a focus on how to get you ready for reentry, right? How to get you ready to go home, right? Whether it's a year, 5 years, 10 years, there should, as soon as you are incarcerated, like, do you have addiction? Do you have mental health issues? Do you have other trauma that is impacting you and stunting you at that point? Like, do you have a skill? Will you be able to go home and work? Is there something that you can do that could help you take care of yourself and your family? Like, those are things that should be addressed, right? And, I think, so countries like Norway, that's what they, their focus is on. How do we make sure that people, Germany too, how do we make sure that our citizens are ready to come home and be productive,
citizens,
to be, a healthy community? But the difference is, especially in Norway, is they don't have to deal with the race, issue. Everybody looks like them. Whereas here, we have these complicated layers of bias, right? I mean, this is a country where, 63% of the kids that are suspended in preschool are Black, right? And so we're suspending preschoolers, first of all. So it's like 63% of the kids suspended are Black, but only like 17% of the students are Black. So that means you start like thinking about, whoa, what's happening?
Yeah.
And that's where it starts, and that's how it kind of moves forward.
Yeah.
So
it's I think difficult also because while not, I think there are a lot of people that have trouble coming up with, well, how much is it going to cost then? You know, is what somebody's going to say. Like an naysayer is essentially going to hop up when you say, I'd like to have this program that leads you on the way out, you know, and this program. But my understanding is there's actually some numbers that show it would actually be cheaper to do that than our current system. Can you talk about that a little bit, about how, if we look at this at a cold numbers perspective, what kind of situation, what would save money versus what we're currently doing? Because you know, you'd mentioned, I think before we got on, that or maybe during the call, that maybe it's you know, $55,000 to $60,000 a year keeping someone in prison.
$76,000 a year in California, you know, and it's I think it's different. It's generally maybe $50,000 to $75,000 a year to keep someone incarcerated, and
that's expensive.
For young people, it's more closer to like $200,000 to $250,000. Yeah, we're spending like $80 billion.
Would it be cheaper to do it differently, right? Would it be cheaper to do it differently, or would we just be adding to this cost?
Well, I think that one of the things that's happening is that we have these sentences, like I said, the 400-year sentences. And so people who are never coming home, right? So that means that you just continue to add to the pie.
You're just supporting that population. So what's the point? I mean, there's some countries, again, this is very different culturally than here in the U.S. We don't like death. We're very scared of death. It's not like, you know, Mexicans talk about, you know, every year we have a, you know, Dia de los Muertos, right? You talk about death is not a scary thing. So I'm not specifically advocating this, but some countries would say it'd be better off to be killed. It'd be than to be stuck in prison for the rest of your life. What's the point? We're paying for this person to be in prison forever. There was a heinous crime committed. They're going to have to live with this. Why don't we just, you know, in Siam, they would say, why don't we just kill them? At that point, or are we really being more merciful? Or are we just torturing somebody because we enjoy torturing them? You know, because we want to see that we're punishing them. And obviously that's a tough thing to bring up. Americans are very afraid of things like that. There's other countries too where they'll do, hey, you fought somebody, so you're going to get a public lashing. We don't like that at all. But kind of that thought, is that really maybe less cruel than keeping somebody in prison forever and ever, you know, for a violent assault, and then you let them go and they can't get a job? The person who gets a lashing in Iraq can still go get a job. Right, so you kind of raise these like cultural questions that stress us out.
I think we can do a little better,
right?
Though, right? Yeah.
Right. So, but it almost becomes like we have our cultural feelings, but it becomes, you know, are we really being less cruel than other places that we tend to judge with these long, you know, like you said, 400-year sentencing, and then you know, you get into here in Texas, there's actually a rule. A law actually in the contracts between these private prisons and the government that there have to be a certain number of people in the prison or Texas loses the prison. So you're essentially incentivizing putting people in prison financially, because otherwise you lose the prison, and you have to pay a fee to the prison. I think it is probably more accurate. So how is that cost kind of comparing? Is there a way that we can lower costs with more sympathetic programs? What do you think?
Well, so first of all, you brought up the fact that everybody should read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, because that's just, everyone should read it. So we really understand like the path from slavery to our current mass incarceration, and how specifically people were, you know, freed and then almost immediately incarcerated and put right back on the plantations as, you know, as incarcerated indentured workers, right? Yeah. So we see that right now. So when you talk about, and I bring that up because when you talk about the private prisons, right, the private prisons are very specifically for profit. However, their fingers have been in the prisons and are in the state prisons, right? From contracts for food to the work that's being done in prisons for cents on the dollar, if that. And so, I mean, what would happen if suddenly the gap and Victoria's Secret or whatever couldn't have all of their, bras made in the prisons across the country, right? Like,
Yeah.
suddenly I guess we're going to have to pay a little more for those or something. I don't know. But if we started thinking about how this has actually infiltrated all of our systems,
Yeah.
and is that part of what's making us think that we should incarcerate more people? How often are we hearing about danger around us from politicians, from lobbyists who are pushing that angle within the media? And I mean, I think that that's something that we have to look a little closer at as well, because obviously there's a lot we could do to tamp down the costs of incarceration. I mean, first of all, like having some more realistic sentencing that was focused on healing and focused on making sure that people would be prepared to go out and get a job and do what they need to do to be successful.
Yeah.
Like building that kind of resilience within within the people that are incarcerated, because there's a lot of brokenness in our prisons, and we need them to come home ready to work, and we don't need them to go to prison for 400 years.
Yeah.
If it's a Charles Manson, yeah, sure, they can be in a psych ward forever, and it probably won't bother them one way or another. But otherwise, think how much money we would save if we instead of spending money just to incarcerate people longer and longer and longer sentences, if we actually focus that money on making sure that people came home ready to work.
Yeah.
That there was a focus on rehabilitation, and and this gets into a lot of the class divide in our country, right? There's not a real interest in people getting educated and being able to get a piece of the larger pie.
Yeah.
There's definitely, with our current administration and with a lot of people in power right now, would much rather us be held down a bit, and so they can have low wage workers. There's we have a minimum wage. It's what, $7.25 an hour in this country still. It's barely moved in 10 years. I mean, that's really sort of unconscionable when you think about it. When you've got CEOs bringing home, millions of dollars and sometimes billion-dollar, payout packages, and we're spending $80 billion a year plus on incarceration. So yeah, I don't think I can really speak to, the death penalty and things like that, but I definitely see like there's a real opportunity to shift the way we see these systems.
Yeah.
And yes, I think there is a lot of bipartisan focus on making some changes, because it isn't working. We're having more and more people incarcerated, more and more communities devastated, more and more children left destitute, and yet it's we're continuing to spend more and more of our GDP on it. Like it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Do you think a lot of people, I think what you'll find, or you've probably already found, because I'm sure you've had some pretty almost tough or angry conversations with folks about this topic, because people get worked up about essentially justice and mercy and all these bigger things. One of the things you brought up, I thought it was interesting, because you said, except for like those Charles Mansons, like how do we as a society decide who is the basically who is essentially worthy of being cast out, right? Who are the Charles Mansons, I think, is a tough question, which I don't know.
It's a medical question, right?
Yeah,
it's
right.
Who is someone a psychopath? Are they a sociopath? Because and you're a doctor, so you may know better than I, but there are some who would not notice or care if they were in, a cage or in a bedroom or whatever. I mean, like there's a difference.
Still be angry and care, like most of your Charles Manson level. Right, people who have ASPD or antisocial personality disorder, they will care, and but it's your fault. It was his fault that I had to kill him. Charles Manson, it's like, well, it's her fault. She did this. She deserved this, which is interesting, because that same thought pattern is the thought pattern of punishment. that you're talking about. They just have an extreme version of it. That yes, everyone else has done wrong. I do not do wrong. It doesn't matter. I do what I do.
Right.
I'm looking out for me. Kind of this, that's the extreme. It's in children we call it conduct disorder, but the extreme, like sociopath, psychopath. I like to set animals on fire, things like that. Where this person deserves it. It's not a big deal. It's not. I'm not. Do we almost have a mini version of that in society of that thought? And it's something that you made me think of just now. I think regardless of how we determine who our bad guys are, right, who deserves to be punished, it sounds like from what you're saying almost everybody can agree on the preventative side of things. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit and kind of hear a little bit more about some of the things you were saying about how do we change our earlier systems so we can prevent this mass incarceration, which is essentially, like you're saying, we're rounding up all the black people, essentially is what it is, right? Which sounds terrible to say, but I mean, that's what's happening. So how do we go back to the beginning and prevent that? Because a lot of people are going to fight about the afterwards things, and it's a fight worth having. But can we stop it to begin with for the next generations? What do you think are kind of those? How do we prevent prison situations?
Right. Well, I mean, I think there definitely has to be a focus on education and taking care of families. My new film is actually around childcare, and there's a lot of intersectionality there, right? Because if you can't go to work, or if you go to work and leave your child at the park, or unsafe, and there's just a lot of bad things that can happen there either way, right? So I think there's been a lot of discussion about different ways to make sure that that families are taken care of, but I think that's one of the first things is like really making sure that there's a focus on care and support from day zero, right?
Yeah.
And that could look like there being like public school extending to birth, right? Like so that there were, there's just infant care centers and preschools, and then there's the K through 12, right? Because when we started public schools, we didn't realize that learning started at zero, and that children would come to school with such a deficit if they didn't have, this care and support, nurturing, and actually learning how to learn at that young age. So that's a big piece of what happens. People are not prepared in so many ways, and they are knocked out of the school systems, right?
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be a lot more education for teachers. There should be a focus on having health centers and mental health workers and support in the schools, because we're talking about preventative, right? So we've already created, a menace of a system. So we've got a lot of families and children who are suffering, right?
Yeah.
So to say that a family should deal with it, I think it's not something that we can say anymore. Like, we've created a problem. We need to figure out how to get people healthy.
Yeah.
And we also have more information now, so we know that it does cause a problem if children don't get what they need.
Yeah.
When they're small. So I think starting there, and then you kind of move on. I mean, I could tell you lots of things kind of going up, but if we start from zero, right? Let's make sure our children are fed. Let's make sure they have good meals every day. And so if we had a childcare system that started from day zero, we can make sure that children were fed every day.
Yeah. That
they didn't have to, worry about being hungry. That they could have what they need to be healthy and to learn how to learn. Yeah. Because again, that, being hungry kind of feeds into all these mood disorders and behavior issues that come up. And then bias makes us, we recently did a study, right, of teachers. And apparently if you're the same race as a child, then you learn more about their, them having trauma or problems at home or whatever. We're more compassionate. But if we're a different race of that child, we're actually less compassionate and more likely to demonize that child or punish that child.
And I think that was a lot across races too, right? It was just this
across races.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So went either way.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's likes, which is how do we change that thought pattern that's so ingrained in that's almost like, you have the fish that likes to swim with the other fish. Like, how do you get all the way down and change those thought patterns? It just kind of comes back to education.
If I'm not thinking about it, I don't know, but you have a good training, trainings that happen, people get to like be exposed to it, and understand, what might be happening. Then, like I think because I'm aware of it, I notice things that I'm biased about all the time, and then I can change that now that I realize it. But it takes, and there I'm sure are things that I'm not noticing, right? So I have to try to. I'm always happy for someone to bring that to my attention, because I want to be aware of and make changes, And I think once we get to a point where we realize that, like, we're not bad people for having these biases, but it's something that maybe we didn't understand. And
that non-punitiveness of it is very difficult too, because what you bring up just there, because there was another study done that a lot of Black kids are not referred, like, who are being abused, are less likely to be called up to CPS, because people are like, oh, I don't want to assume things because by white teachers or by someone else, because they're like, oh, I don't want to assume things because it's somebody else's culture. So you get to like that, it's like, oh, I don't want to be racist, so I'm not going to call on this child who needs help because maybe I just don't understand. So, which kind of gets back to that, what you were literally just saying, like this punitiveness of this badness, this. So how do we get to a point where we're not that, it's like we have these pitfalls on all sides of what we do. It becomes a little bit ridiculous.
Life is a journey, though. I mean, I think that, my dad's Buddhist, and I wouldn't claim to be anything, but I think that I learned so much from him, and just this focus on, every day being a journey, every day being an opportunity to learn, and that in fact, if we're not learning, that's actually not a good thing. It's not about a destination. It is about a journey. And I don't know about you, but a day where I'm not learning anything is not a good day for me. I want to learn. I want to take in, whether it's like seeing something new or seeing my daughter discover something new, or whatever it is, like that is wonderful. And I think it's sometimes also really painful, but the alternative is worse. Right. So
I mean, and that kind of comes back to, can we instill the ability to enjoy that kind of learning in people? And I think a lot of the frustration has been with the current welfare system, and with a lot of the current schooling, is that you create dependence. You create, oh, I am the mighty white master, and here I'm, from my government seat, because most of our government officials are still white, right? That's still the way it is. I'm the mighty white master. Here I am providing for you, my, Black inner city dependent. And the way we're thinking about things, the way things are framed, the way that schools are framed, you create this kind of mentality. And this was very clear in Puerto Rico, creating this mentality of dependence rather than independence, creating, rather than interdependence is, I think, the way somebody else puts it. Can we, how does a society with this very difficult past move past that into, we're all taking care of each other, and we're doing this freely, not coercion, not like there's somebody over. So I've liked a lot of the nonprofits that have, I had just read about a very interesting group today that I don't agree with all of their movements. I'll put the link in the description, but one of the things that they want to do is try to, they're, I think, primarily a Buddhist movement, but try to take a lot of these things away from government and not just put them kind of in the hands of companies and things like that, but put them in the hands of communities. Like, can we create community groups that are going to work together to take care of each other? How do you kickstart that, right? How do you essentially crowdfund government is what there's another organization had said. which is another way of thinking about like the cradle. How do we create that cradle to up education without creating an education of I'm over you, I am dependent. I was reading about a child who was taught during Black History Month. This is a Black child who was taught that it was because they were kind of more backward or more inferior that Black people became slaves, and that now we have to like rescue people from that. And so this like brave white man story, I think, is still being told today by both sides of the political aisle.
The great white hope.
You have a very interconnected brain that thinks about all of these different things.
It's
so
like,
it's absolutely
I need to be more
fascinating.
focused sometimes, but it's been fascinating being on this tour, like taking the film across the country and having these conversations, because there is all this intersectionality, and I do think it's all connected, and it is about us having to push through some really painful, our really, really painful past and some really painful ways of seeing ourselves. And, but I think the opportunity is great.